friends, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be doing some air dry clay projects for Halloween. I like to use Sculpey air dry clay. You can use any air dry clay that you'd like for these projects. And for this project we're going to be doing some little ghost plaques that you can hang on your wall. So I'll just be using this candle mold that I got from Amazon. It is a ghost, but I'm actually going to cut this in half so that we can turn this into a mold to make the ghost plaques. Once I have cut this in half, then I'm going to take a little bit of my air dry clay and I'm going to press it into these molds. Now these are super flexible because, like I said, they are meant for candles. So you may have to just hold it in your hand and then cut off the excess clay because it is a little difficult to get them down in the mold perfectly, so you may have to cut a little bit off. The most important part is just getting them in the mold to get that nice ghostly sheet look. Now once I had them made, then I just used a little screwdriver to poke some tiny little holes through there. Just use whatever you have on hand to make their eyes, and then I am going to use a little bit of water on my fingers to smooth out all of the edges. I ended up making 3 of these. You can make as many as you want and they would be perfect to add into a little wall gallery. I ended up setting these aside for about 24 hours to let that clay harden, and then I'm going to go over each of these with 2 coats of some white acrylic paint. Now you could also paint these different colors, maybe some little black ghost or some gold ghost, whatever you want to do. Once the paint was completely dry, then I'm going to go back in with some super glossy Mod Podge, and again I gave each of these 2 coats front and back with this Mod Podge. You could leave these as is, but for mine I wanted to add some of these Halloween temporary tattoos onto 2 of them. So it's very simple. I got these from Amazon and just press them onto the ghost. Then to hang them, I added some command strips to the back of these. For this project, I found this plaque at the thrift store and wanted to turn it into a witch's cottage plaque. So again, you'll need some air dry clay and then just some stamps. I'm going to start by rolling out some air dry clay just big enough to fit over the plate that is on that wall plaque. Then I'm going to take that piece of clay and I'm going to lay it over the plaque. For this particular plaque, it does have a raised edge where there's a plate in the center. So I was able to kind of run my finger around the edges so that I would know exactly where to cut my clay. Then I'll use my finger and smooth it out around the plate that's in the center. To be sure this stays in place, I'm using a little bit of wood glue and then laying it back down onto there. Then for the fun part of actually making the sign, I am starting using a little decorative stamp that I had there at the top, and then I'm going to use some letter stamps to spell out Witch's Cottage. Set that aside and let that clay completely harden and dry, and then I am going over this with 2 coats of some black chalk paint. Once that's dry, to finish this off, I'm going to go over it with some European Gold Rub and Buff and a big fluffy brush. For this project, I wanted to make a Halloween flower frog to put over a little vase. So I am starting by rolling out some of that air dry clay, and then I have a spider web stencil. So I'm going to lay that on top of my air dry clay and gently roll it over onto that clay. As you can see, it leaves that nice impression of the spider web in the clay. Then I'm just going to take a razor blade and I'm going to go around and make the shape of a kind of wonky spider web. If you want it to be perfect, you can definitely use a spider web template or something like that. I wanted mine to kind of be messy around the edges, but once I finish that, then I'm just poking some holes in the center of this to turn it into a flower frog. You can leave it flat to dry if that's what you wanted, but I wanted mine to have a scalloped edge. So I'm just using some of these little thick wood dowels that I had in my crafting stash to make the edges of this scalloped. And once I have them placed, then I'm going to set this aside and let that air dry clay harden for again about a day or so. Once it was finished drying, then I went around all the edges with a little bit of sandpaper just to smooth those out. And then I'm going to go over this with 2 coats of some black chalk paint. Now, if you wanted to, you could go in with a really small paintbrush and make the lines of the spider web white. But for mine, I just went over it with some European Gold Rub and Buff. For this project, I'm going to be making a witch's hat. So to start this off, I am rolling a larger chunk of air dry clay out just to make it look like the top of the witch's hat. Then I'm going to press my thumb up into the bottom part of this witch's hat. And I'm just going to start kind of pulling very gently and smushing this clay together at the bottom so that I can pull this out enough to make the rim of the hat. And at this point, don't worry if the clay tears a little bit. As you can see, once I sat mine down, it did have a few rips and tears. That's fine. We can just smush that clay right back together. And if you need to, you can just add a little bit more air dry clay to all those edges to make them a little thicker and fix any of the spots where the clay tore. Now I'm going to make my witch's hat light up in just a little bit, so I want to make sure that a little tea light candle will fit there in the bottom. So just press that up into there, because when your clay is drying, it is going to shrink a little bit, so you want to make sure to leave that up in there for the clay to dry around. And right now I just sprayed it with a little bit of water, and I'm going to use my finger to smooth out all of the lumpiness and any areas where I had placed new clay on top of the other clay so that I can rub those in together. And like I said, I want this to light up, so I'm actually using these little fondant. So the one I'm using is just a star shape, and these fondant stamp thingies actually have a little plunger on them, so you can usually just pull the clay out, but since my clay was a little wet, I just poked it back through there. Then I wanted to add a little bit of embellishments on to this hat, so I'm rolling out a piece of clay. I'm gonna flatten it with my roller and cut it to make the little ribbon that goes around it. Now if you wanted to, you could use a little bit of gel super glue to attach this piece to that bottom part, but since my clay was wet, it actually sticks together quite well. Pretty much a wet clay is like super glue to itself anyway. So I just used my finger and smoothed that out around the witch's hat. Then I wanted to add a little bit more, so I have this fall leaf mold that I ended up just making 3 little leaves, and then for this I did use some gel super glue to attach those to the front of the hat. And for this one, just like the flower frog that I made, I decided I wanted to scallop the brim of the hat. So I just used those little wood dowels again, and then I'm going to let this dry for about 2 days. And once it was dry, because it did have all of these pieces to it and little edges and small crevices, I did take this outside and give it 1 coat of some black spray paint before bringing it back in and doing the second coat with some black acrylic paint. Then I am going to leave this mostly black, but I did take a tiny paintbrush with some European Gold Rub and Buff and just do some of the details on the hat, like the leaves and the little ribbon that goes around the center and the edges of the brim before giving it a coat of some super gloss Mod Podge.